The lesson for today's talk is very simple. Be very careful if during a fantasy auction of your church, where you auction off, say, labor-intensive things like preparing a talk, that you may get more than you bargained for. After KC1 picking the topic for a talk for the year, he came up to me gleefully and said, "I'm going to pick something that requires lots of research." Now, you may find it a bit ironic. Let me adjust this a little bit. I am an English major who never had to do anything with Ralph Waldo Emerson. I know that's shocking. In my school, I managed to totally avoid American literature of any sort. Yes, I have an English education degree, and all I took was British Lit, Shakespeare, Milton, modern novel, even an elective on science fiction, but never the Transcendentalists and never Ralph Waldo Emerson. So this is all brand spanking new to me, pretty much. So here we go. Oh, and the other thing is I'm not a huge poetry fan either. And so Casey's topic was, he gave me 2 poems and said, take these 2 poems, explain them in light of Transcendentalism, do it all in approximately 20 minutes. You know, they do teach entire semester-long courses on this, Casey. So, well, here we go. In only 20 to 30 minutes, the entire history of Transcendentalism, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and his poem. And I went and looked this up online a lot to see if I could pronounce it correctly. And I'm still not entirely sure I'm going to say it right, but it's Nothi Sialton. How's that?
Scholar can tell you.
We got Hal. Is that close enough?
That's close enough.
Close enough. It's Greek, and it means know thyself. And you could do a whole talk just on the history of that phrase. It's carved on the Delphic temple. But I'm not going to go into that because I already have way too much to talk about. But Hal actually came by the house yesterday and dropped off a whole newspaper article on that very topic. And he said, well, you might be able to use this. Well, I did read it, however, I'm not going to use it because it's already too long. But I appreciate that anyway. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a Unitarian minister back before we were Unitarian Universalists. And he wasn't one for very long, but his impact on Unitarian Universalism is huge. He graduated from Harvard Divinity School at the ripe old age of 18. He became an associate minister at Second Church in Boston for a year, and then became the minister, and he served for 2 years as the full-time primary minister, and then he resigned. And there's various theories as to why he did that. Again, not terribly relevant, other than he didn't really feel it was God's calling for him to be doing this in this setting. And you might get a better feel for that as we go along. So the approach I took was, he wrote this poem so that people would be able to just take it at face value, read it, and understand it for themselves. So what I did not do was go out and look at various critics' remarks or explanations of it, but rather I went through it myself, read it, made some notations, and then afterwards decided to do further research to fill out the talk today. So the first part is Doug looking at it cold, without any even college background on this. And we're going to go through it line by line as though we were going through Scripture, so you can see what it is he is trying to say to you about knowing thyself. If thou canst bear strong meat of simple truth, if thou durst my words compare with what thou thinkest in thy soul's free youth, then take this fact into thy soul. God dwells in thee. It is no metaphor or parable. It is unknown to thousands and to thee, yet there is God. So he starts off pretty bold. God dwells in you. It's not a metaphor. It's not a parable. I'm not using symbolism. No, really, God lives in you. He means this seriously. He is in thy world, but thy world knows him not. He is the mighty heart from which life's varied pulses part. Clouded and shrouded, there doth sit the infinite, embosomed in a man, and thou art stranger to thy guest. And knowest not that thou dost invest the clouds that veil his life within are thick woven webs of sin, which his glory struggling through darkens to thine evil hue. God is in you, but the light of God, it struggles to get out through the veil of sin that you put up. Your refusal to know that God is there, your refusal to listen. The evil that you do blocks this light from coming forth. Then bear thyself, O man, up to the scale and compass of thy guest, soul of thy soul. Be great as doth beseem the ambassador who bears the royal presence where he goes. Now he compares you to someone who goes ahead of the king, the ambassador, announcing the presence of the king. You should live this way, for God dwells in you. Give up to thy soul, let it have its way. It is, I tell thee, God himself, the selfsame one that rules the whole. Though he speaks through thee with stifled voice, and looks through thee shorn of its beams, but if thou listen to its voice, to his voice, if thou obey the royal thought, it will grow clearer to thine ear, more glorious to thine eye. The clouds will burst that veil him now, and thou shalt see the Lord. So now he's telling you, if you'll just listen, if you'll just make room for God to come forth, that sin that veils the presence of God within you will part. The clouds will break, and the glory will shine forth from within you. It's not an external thing. It's coming forth from within you. Therefore be great, not proud, too great to be proud. Let not thine eyes rove, peep not into corners. Let thine eyes look straight before thee, as befits the simplicity of power. And in thy closet carry state, filled with light, walk therein. And as a king would do no treason to his own empire, so do not thou to thine. Be great, but not proud. Carry yourself as royalty, because God is within you. Do not be distracted by trifles in the corners. Don't have that brain like the dog on the cartoon that goes, squirrel! It's constantly looking off. Focus. Focus on the important things. See, I took something so serious and threw it in a cup. I'd probably get dinged for that in preaching class. No, as a king, you should live, and as a king, do not commit treason against your own empire. In other words, against yourself. This is the reason why thou dost recognize things now first revealed, because in thee resides the Spirit that lives in all. And thou canst learn the laws of nature, because its author is latent in thy breast. The Spirit of God lives in all, not just you, all. And you can learn these laws of nature because the author of the laws of nature is within you. Therefore, O happy youth, happy if thou dost know and love this truth. Thou art unto thyself a law. And since the soul of things is in thee, thou needest nothing out of thee. The law, the gospel, and the providence, heaven, hell, and the judgment, and the stores immeasurable of truth and good, all these thou must find within thy single mind, or never find. You will only find these things within your own thoughts, within your own soul. If you cannot find them there, you will never find them. Don't look to the outside, look to the inside. Thou art the law. The gospel has no revelation of peace and hope until there is response from the deep chambers of thy mind thereto. The rest is straw. It can reveal no truth unknown before. The providence, thou art thyself, that doth dispense wealth to thy work, want to thy sloth, glory to goodness, to neglect the moth. Thou sowest the wind, the whirlwind reapest. Thou payest the wages of thine own work. Through all ages, the almighty energy within crowneth virtue and curseth sin. Virtue sees by its own light, stumbleth sin in self-made night. Now, some of these words are a little archaic, but what he's saying is, you are the law, and you are the source of reward and punishment for breaking that law. You dispense wealth to your work, and want to thy sloth. External sources will not have an effect on you. You must find an inner reward for your work, or you're not going to want to work. If you don't find your own sloth unacceptable, you will continue to do nothing. It is God in us that crowns the virtue and curses sin. In other words, don't be looking to other people or external sources for reward or punishment. If you are open to the God within you, then you will punish yourself. You will say this is unacceptable and you will change. And that's terribly profound because change must come from within. Who approves thee doing right? God in thee. Who condemns thee doing wrong? God in thee. Who punishes thine evil deed? God in thee. What is thine evil meed? Which means reward. Thy worse mind, with error blind and more prone to evil. That is the greater hiding of the God within and the loss of peace. The terrible displeasure of this inmate, and next the consequence, more faintly, as more distant wrought upon our outward fortunes, which decay with vice, with virtue rise. Again, punishment and reward comes from God within thee, and if you choose evil, the punishment is the hiding of God within you and the displeasure of God within you. What is your punishment for disobeying? The loss of peace. Because God lives within you. And if that God is unhappy that is within you, you will not have peace. The selfsame God, by the same law that makes the souls of angels glad and the souls of devils sad, see, there is nothing else but God wherever I look. All things hasten back to him. Light is but his shadow dim. Shall I ask wealth or power of God, who gave an image of himself to be in my soul? As well might swilling ocean ask for a wave, or the starred firmaments a dying coal. For that which is in me lives in the whole. Since our soul is God, God within us, Emerson thinks that asking God for something like power or wealth would be as silly as the ocean asking to be given a wave, or the starry sky asking for a single burning coal. What more can you ask for? God lives within you. So that's my interpretation without any research, taking it in. That's what it meant to me as I read it. Now it's time to see if this is really accurate. What did Emerson really mean? Was I on track or did I totally miss it? I used two main sources. First of all, a book called The Mind on Fire. It's a massive 600-plus page biography of Emerson by Robert D. Richardson. Didn't read the whole thing. And there are limits to what I'm going to do for an auction. But by going through that, I was turned to a second great source, Emerson's own Divinity School address, a famous lecture that he gave about 7 years after he wrote this poem to the senior class at Harvard Divinity School as they graduated, his alma mater. When Emerson delivered this now famous address, Unitarianism as a new denomination, which had evolved out of Congregationalism, was only 13 years old. Brand spanking new denomination. And it was barely distinguishable in many respects from conventional Christian churches at the time. It was congregational in governance, meaning much like we do today, the congregation made the decision. So in that sense, it was very different from the Catholics or the Episcopalians, but still very similar to the congregational churches. The key doctrinal difference that they denied the Trinity isn't quite so radical when you realize, yeah, they denied the Trinity, but they still thought Jesus was divine. So Jesus wasn't just another human like you or me, something in between, something greater than the angels, but not quite God. And they were afraid to go any further than that, lest they be totally rejected by the other Christian denominations. Emerson's proposal then, if you think about it, was incredibly radical for a Unitarian minister to say something like this. God dwells within each one of you was different from the doctrines of Unitarianism at the time. It's also important that Emerson taught something very different about Jesus. Consider these words straight from his address to those graduates. Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. He saw with open eye the mystery of the soul. Drawn by its severe harmony, ravished with its beauty, he lived in it and had his being there. Alone in all history, he estimated the greatness of man. That's a profound statement right there. When most religions were teaching the depravity of man, he said Jesus taught the greatness of man. One man was true to what is in you and me. He saw that God incarnates himself in man and evermore goes forth anew to take possession of the world. He said, in this jubilee of sublime emotion, I am divine. Through me, God acts. Through me, speaks. Would you see God? See me. Or see thee. When thou also thinkest as I now think. In other words, Emerson's saying when Jesus said, I and the Father are one, he's saying, you can say that too. Everyone can say that. It's not just me. It's all of us. If you'll open your eyes, God lives within each one of us. This is a radical departure from Christianity at the time. And then Emerson says, this was the true message of Jesus, that God lives within you, but it's been twisted. And now the churches say this instead. This was Jehovah come down out of heaven. I will kill you if you say he was a man. That's how he viewed the doctrines of the day. Instead of saying God lives within us, the churches were saying, you can't say that, and if you do, we'll kill you. Now, not necessarily literally, although in the past that had been the case. He also believed that miracles were greatly misunderstood. He, Jesus, spoke of miracles, for he felt that man's life was a miracle, and that all man doth. And he knew that this daily miracle shines as the character ascends. But the word miracle, as pronounced by Christian churches, gives a false impression. It is a monster. It is not one with the blowing clover and the falling rain. In other words, Emerson believed that the miracles were nature itself, life itself. And he believed that this is what Jesus spoke of when he talked of miracles. And that again, it had been lost over the passage of time as humans corrupted the teachings of Jesus. So when Emerson claims that God is in us, he is also claiming that this is the true message of Christianity. He attacks the formalness, lifelessness, and errors of the churches of his day, including the Unitarian churches. Their creed taught that you shall not be a man. You cannot be a man. You shall not own the world. You shall not dare and live after the infinite law that is in you and in company with the infinite beauty which heaven and earth reflect to you in all its lovely forms. No, you must subordinate your nature to Christ's nature. You must accept our interpretations and take his portrait as the vulgar draw it. That is always best which gives me to myself. This is what Emerson is saying is true now. The sublime is excited in me by great stoical doctrine. Obey thyself. That which shows God in me fortifies me. That which shows God is out of me makes me a wart or a wen, which is like a cyst. There is no longer a necessary reason for my being. Already the long shadows of ultimate oblivion creep over me and I shall decease forever. So what he's saying is, the church has been teaching, you're never going to be a real man, and pardon his language because he wasn't including women, that was the way they spoke back then. You will not own the world, you will not dare, you cannot fulfill the infinite law. No, rather the church is saying, subordinate yourself to Christ's nature because your nature is corrupt. And Emerson says, no, I will not stand for this. That which elevates me, that which shows God in me fortifies me. Not these teachings that I am corrupt and evil and sinful, but rather those teachings that say God lives within each one of us. These are the doctrines that are worthwhile. Otherwise, I'm just a wart or a cyst. I'm going to fade into oblivion. I am nothing. Emerson found that formal church services were dull and completely missing the point. Whenever the pulpit is usurped by a formalist, then is the worshiper defrauded and disconsolate. We shrink as soon as the prayers begin. which do not uplift but smite us and offend us. We are fain to wrap our cloaks about us and secure as best we can a solitude that hears it not. I once heard a preacher who sorely tempted me to say I would go to church no more. Men go, I thought, where they are wont to go, or used to going. Else had no soul ever entered the temple in the afternoon. A snowstorm was falling around us. The snowstorm was real, the preacher merely spectral. And the eye felt the sad contrast looking at him and then out of the window behind him at the beautiful meteor of snow. He had lived in vain. He had no one word intimating that he had ever laughed or wept, that he was married or in love, that he had commended or cheated or chagrined. If he had ever lived and acted, we were none the wiser for it. The capital secret of his profession, namely to convert life into truth, he had not learned. Not one fact in all his experience had he imported into his doctrine. He goes on to say that this poor minister up there, who was almost like a ghost compared to the reality of the snowfall outside, never talked about anything pertaining to life. It was dry doctrine, but he never talked about the pain of life, the joys of life, the interaction of people. Never, never, never. And this is all that mattered in Emerson's mind. He said it was strange that people would even keep coming to church, but somewhere inside there was this faint hope that they would find something that would touch their soul by going here week after week. But he said the words were vain, and they just remembered better hours, better times, better words from better ministers. But those days were gone. Emerson believed that we learned from each other. He'd probably love our little discussion circles afterwards, because he really felt that we learned from our life experiences, not from creeds and doctrine. And the mind-killing nature of the churches of his day, he said, even facing that, people still went in the faint hope of finding something uplifting within their soul and being made better. But to him, the proper foundation of religion, of spirituality, would be listening carefully to God within us. To quote from Richardson's book, Emerson's address was indeed an attack on formal historical Christianity, but the talk was even more dangerous than that. For Emerson proposed as a counterweight to formal religion, not atheism, but personal religious consciousness. I deny personality to God because it is too little, not too much, he said. Think about that. I deny that God has a personality because it makes God small. God, being infinite, would not have a personality because God lives within each one of us and every living thing. Richardson calls this hypertheism, the declaration of the divinity of the human, but it did not represent mainstream Unitarians, never mind mainstream Protestants. Andrews Norton, who was Emerson's professor at Divinity School, attacked Emerson's teaching in a Boston newspaper article, which was about the best way you could get the word out back then. So this is the equivalent of being on all the Sunday talk shows. And he said, remember, this is a Unitarian saying this, there can be no intuition, no direct perception of the truths of Christianity. We must have Christianity through the Bible and its miracles, through the churches and its authorities, or not at all. So now we're fighting about what is it to be Christian. And Emerson's saying, you guys got it wrong. God lives within all of us, and that was the message of Jesus, and that should be the message of Christianity. Ann Woodleaf, who gave a talk to the First Unitarian Church of Richmond, Virginia, summed it up very nicely. He, Norton, called the graduates accessories to a crime for inviting Emerson to speak to them. He was especially concerned that such false preachers could have a disastrous effect upon the religion and moral state of the community, that general evildoing might break out in the community because of his speech. Emerson's response in his journal only was, it is plain from all the noise that there is atheism somewhere. The only question now is, which is the atheist? Norton soon became known as the hard-headed Unitarian Pope. He had many clergy and conservatives on his side who thought Emerson was a dangerous atheist and even taught their children that he was a sort of mad dog.
Wow.
Now take a breath and let that all settle in. This debate marks a major turning point in Unitarian thought. Even though Emerson was no longer a Unitarian minister, he was well respected and was on the lecture circuit all the time giving these ideas out. He had lit the fuse to that keg of dynamite, and when the dust and debris settled, things would never be the same in the Unitarian world. This is not to say that they all accepted what Emerson taught, but Unitarianism was moving away from biblical literalism, believing the miracles were literal events, and moving towards the inherent worth and dignity of each person. After all, if God lives within each, we are certainly worth dignity and worth respect. Personal introspection and spiritual insights would become more important in Unitarianism, and ultimately we arrived at the fourth principle, that we are all to be able to have a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. All of us. Free and responsible. Emerson tells us to know ourselves. He believed that God dwells within each one of us, but he also felt that the church of the day had completely misunderstood what God was. God, this force for good, dwelt within each one of us, and each person could, independently and without formalized teaching, become attuned to God and do this good instinctively. Our intuition, if we listen to it, is God leading us to live the best way we can live. Because Emerson defined God in this way, he was accused of being an atheist because he denied the personality of God. Yet in response, and with no irony, he could say, one of us is an atheist. It's just a question of which one. Because the God he believed in was not believed in by the theists. So it's a matter of who defines the terms. He fully believed that he was the one who believed in God. He did not call himself anything other than a Christian and a Unitarian, but his teachings were so radically different. To show you how radical this theology of individuals inspired directly by God was, here's an answer he gave when he was asked what he believed of Jesus. It seemed to me an impiety to be listening to one another when the pure heaven was pouring itself out into each one of us on the simple condition of obedience. To listen to any second-hand gospel is perdition of the first gospel. Jesus was Jesus because he refused to listen to another and listened at home. In other words, listened to his own soul, to the God within. So what do we do with this? Emerson's philosophy is certainly possible, but it's also really hard to prove, as indeed is any theology. Just the other day, I had an old friend call me up. Hadn't talked to him in a couple years. He's a minister in a different denomination, and he was bemoaning the fact that in his denomination there were no new interpretations. In fact, they were sort of hardening their position on many things and trying to solidify creeds and doctrines that they must all believe. And he said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could simply acknowledge that all theology is speculation? That's a great quote, and I knew I had to squeeze it into this sermon. All theology is speculation, but it's speculation that drives what's important to us. It drives how we live. Emerson couldn't prove to anyone that God lived within him, but it drove how he lived. And whether you believe in God or not, however you define the God you believe in, you are speculating. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Some people call it faith. But something within you, your conscience, something causes that conscience to cause you to determine a course of action, to determine a personal morality, to determine how you are going to react in situations where you could cause harm, but for some indefinable reason you choose to do good, to do well-being to others. This is important to people. Emerson calls this listening to the inner voice, to listening to God within you, to following your intuition. Whatever you want to call it, it is vastly important because we all live by something that comes from within, whether it be God or not, however you want to define it. the practical application is virtually the same. Emerson says, clear your thoughts, listen to your intuition, and you will live a good life, for you will be following God within. You don't have to say that your conscience is driven by God to do that exact same thing. People live by a conscience, indefinable, speculative, that nonetheless causes them to do, for lack of a better word, good. We are faced with these choices continuously. Are we going to follow our conscience? Do we trust our conscience? Is God inside of us directing our conscience? Or is it something resulting from evolution or something we don't understand at all? Whatever it is, it can move us to greatness and compassion. We may speculate, but we can't deny this power within each one of us. And when we gather in our discussion circle today, we will be speculating, but we will be sharing what it is that drives each one of us, and will help us to know ourselves a little better because of this interaction. So now all I can say is thank you so much for coming. It's been a huge turnout. Thank you for listening. And most importantly, please stay after as we discuss what it is that drives us to live the way we live and honor the memory of Emerson. Thank you.